And so I see we have one attendee on. Today we have a distinguished speaker before us, a senior leader with 25 years experience in the US Air Force, sharing his view on building leaders. Good morning, my name is Ronaldo. I am the WHS E&Q manager at Untitled, and this webinar is provided by the Australian Institute of Health and Safety. A special thanks to Sarah from National Office for her support, and to you, the members who are joining us today, for putting time aside to be here. Now, if you have any questions for Scott along the way, I would encourage you to put any questions into the question and Q&A box. If you see down below in your webinar, in Zoom webinar, there's a Q&A and a chat box. We'll be monitoring the Q&A section really carefully, and if there's anything you'd like to look into a bit deeper or raise a question, please put into that section. Now, it is with great pleasure that I introduce our speaker. He's a US Air Force Colonel, Scott Campbell. He is an ace fighter pilot of the famous A-10 Warthog, the MQ-9 Reaper. He's received 3 Distinguished Cross Flying Medals and 2 Bronze Stars, a former Top Gun pilot, Top Gun instructor, I should say, sorry, a former fighter wing commander, former Vice Commandant of the US Air Force Academy in Colorado, and currently is positioned to integrate into non-military life. Colonel Campbell, we welcome you and invite you to say hello and give us an appreciation of your career.
All right, thanks, Ronaldo, and thanks to Sarah for helping us with the technology here. And I'd prefer to be in Australia with y'all, but we all have some restrictions these days, so I'm glad I could join you virtually. What I'm going to do this morning is, before Ronaldo and I get into the conversation, targeting leadership in particular, was no fighter pilot briefs without videos. We like pictures and we like videos, and I brought both today to hopefully keep you entertained. If the conversation gets dull, you've got something to look at. But what I'll do now is I'm going to share my screen with the little video, and this is a close air support video. And what I'll do is I'll give you a little bit of a background on the aircraft, as well as the mission of the A-10. So what you see here popping up, just to set the stage, is the definition with all the services in the Department of Defense here in the United States agree that the definition of close air support. And close air support is joint by nature because we support other services when we provide it. And as you see here, kind of taking you through a day in the life in what used to be my office and was my office for almost 23 years of my 25-year career in the A-10. And you can see as we're getting ready to roll, takes a lot of other people to generate these sorties. And there's a lot of preparation. So before we walk out the door, we're literally spending usually the day prior mission planning, and then a couple hours briefing before we get out. Lock the canopy down and roll out onto the runway. And it takes a lot of our maintenance folks to keep these airplanes rolling and flying and ready to go. And here you've got a 2-ship on the runway taking off. You can see we communicate a lot with hand signals right there. That head nod is telling the other aircraft to bring up his landing gear, and off they go on their sortie. Most of the footage you're going to see here is between Korea and Alaska, so you'll see a pretty varied picture of terrain, but it is reflective of the fact that the aircraft operates all over the world, both in peacetime and in combat. What they're going to do here is, which is pretty typical in a lot of our combat sorties, is get right to the air refueling tanker. So right there you can see kind of a ballet in the sky of connecting up to a flying gas station, which can be pretty exciting, especially when you're doing it at night on night vision goggles, and being in close proximity to another aircraft that's carrying 200,000 pounds of jet fuel on board. But it's a very critical skill for fighter pilots, and the A-10's no exception. Is it allows us to stay airborne for extended periods of time, because while the aircraft carries about 2.5 hours of fuel, at any time when we have that capability available, we can just head to the tanker and top off. Typically, when in the close air support mission, you're going to see we're going to go out and you're going to see 2 main weapons employed here right at the beginning, and those are the 30mm cannon and the Maverick missile. And both were designed specifically for close air support and for killing tanks. So they're anti-armor weapons. What makes them really good for close air support is, as you saw in the beginning, the definition really is focused on close proximity to friendlies. And these weapons can be employed inside 100 meters, and in some cases as close as 25 meters, with a target being that close to the friendly force where we can kill a target without injuring our friendlies on the ground. So key capabilities that the aircraft brings. Typically in the coordination that we do in close air support, you can see on the cockpit there, all kinds of writing. We write all over the cockpit in grease pencil. We'll write down on the knee board like the pilot's doing right there. But we're talking to the ground parties, so the terminal attack controllers are passing us targeting data. Sometimes that's coordinates, and a lot of times it's the description of what the target looks like. While we have some really high technology systems when we're in the low altitude environment, typically the first time you're gonna get eyes on that target is right now as you're coming over the ridge line here in the cockpit, and you are looking for that target. And hopefully those folks on the ground have given you a good description so you can put rounds on target in your first pass. That makes it more survivable for you, and it makes it more survivable for the teams on the ground. The A-10 was actually built in the late 1970s, and the youngest A-10 we have in the fleet right now is approaching 40 years old. And we certainly did not envision it being around this long. It was built around the 30mm cannon to the fact that the landing gear in the nose is actually offset because there's no room for it in the center of the aircraft because the gun is there. The gun weighs 4,000 pounds by itself and is the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. You can imagine that when it sits there. In the mid-2000s, you can see there the pilot has that monocle over his eye. That's part of a helmet-mounted cueing system that we put into the jet in the mid-2000s when we upgraded the aircraft from what we call the legacy A-10 to now the precision engagement package, which is the A-10C model, which is why in the cockpit you see all those multifunction displays. We have radios that go beyond and over the horizon. The pilot can engage all his sensors with that monocle over the eye at anything he's looking at. But while we improved all these capabilities, we retained all the survivability that the aircraft is able to take hits and keep going because of so many redundant systems, to include a titanium bathtub that the pilot sits in. So, and here the pilot finishes up, but as he's coming into the chocks here, the mission's not over, because while our maintainers get ready to go and turn the aircraft, the pilots are gonna go in and debrief the sortie, which will take another 2 to 3 hours. So it's not just all fun and games, though I will tell you it's a lot of fun. It's probably the greatest job in the world, if you ask me. So with that, I'll throw it back to Reynaldo to kick off our conversation here.
Cheers for that, Scott. That's Colonel. That's fantastic. What a great view. Now, I guess this webinar here is built on the fact that your experience building leaders and how you prepare them for to sit in a cockpit, and even beyond that. And I guess going in reverse hierarchical order, Colonel, when in your career did you reach a senior leadership position, and what were you doing before that?
So the senior leader, the way we in the Air Force look at it, is typically when you reach the grade of colonel and you're a commander in that grade. So we have 2 commands as a colonel, a group command and a wing command. Typically that's the senior leader. So by the time you reach it, you typically in that 18 to 20 years of experience. And so it's, I'll share some more just because I think that it's helpful, it's illustrative, if you would, when you look at how do we build a senior leader. So and I'll speak from the standpoint as an A-10 pilot, a fighter pilot. is we build a technician. So you start out as a technician, and what we expect is you to be the best fighter pilot in the world. And within that realm, you have different levels of responsibility. You start out as a wingman. So as I alluded to earlier, we usually go out with 2 jets or 4 jets at a time. And so as a wingman, you're there and you're following a flight lead. And then we train, as you get more experience, to be a flight lead or a flight leader, where you lead another pilot around, that wingman. And then as you get more experience as a flight lead, you become qualified to lead more wingmen. So you go from leading 2 to 4, and we eventually build up to be an instructor and an evaluator. But the key is to start as an expert in your craft. And this spans everything, right? So this is our model, but in our model, you have to be an expert in your weapon system, which is your craft. And that brings the credibility, because I can't walk in and lead a squadron of fighter pilots if I don't have the highest level of qualifications in the aircraft. So that's really where we focus early on, is to start getting you to be an expert in the weapon system, and then give our pilots more responsibility, not just in the air, leading other aircraft, but then within the squadron. So as a young captain, so when you're in that, probably 5 to 8 year time frame, we put you in charge of a flight, probably about 8 to 12 people, and then we build there up to become a squadron commander eventually, which is, in most fighter squadrons, it's probably about 50 people, and that's a big part of that is because our maintenance folks are under a separate organization, and then eventually we move you into that group command as a colonel, that first senior leader opportunity. And really, your squadron commander experience is really that decision point when the Air Force decides whether or not they believe you have the opportunity to command at the next level, that first senior level, which is really where you're expanding into other areas. And in my case, I had 1,000 airmen in my group. In Kandahar, Afghanistan was where I commanded. And then the same thing is, if you show that you can excel as a group commander, typically within a wing, you have at least 4 groups, if not more. And then you step up to be a wing commander. So that's really the path that I took. Was I commanded a fighter squadron. And then when I was promoted to colonel, I commanded an air expeditionary group, so not a traditional command in the States. It was actually a deployed combat command. So I commanded in Afghanistan with a very, very unique group that I had there, which didn't include just aircraft. I had a lot of other support assets and capabilities. And then as a wing commander, I commanded an A-10 wing, but I was also an installation commander of a base of 11,000 people. So frankly, the part of now being credible in a weapon system, it becomes more important to have that leadership capability to step into any scenario, because frankly, my time as a wing commander was less about being a good A-10 pilot, which I still was, and I still had to be good at it. That was the expectation of my young pilots, but I was really spending time being the mayor of a small city. So I would say that as much as I'd like to focus my time on flying, I probably spent more time on fixing roads and as we would like to say, roads and commodes, the not so sensational part of the job of keeping a base running. That was the bigger part of it. But that was the idea, though, is those previous experiences would train you to step into a scenario. It wasn't about being an expert fighter pilot anymore. It was being a problem solver, being able to lead people, to manage assets, that type.
That's a great description. Thanks. And how did your seniors or your leadership team prepare you for such a journey? I mean, becoming a technician and growing into that capacity, was there a lot of mentoring? Was there any accredited training or training programs? What did it look like?
A lot of it, I'll tell you, is learning all the parts and pieces was kind of journeys along the way where typically what we do is we're developing our young leaders as we continue to throw them into areas that they're unfamiliar with. So I would say it's less about, frankly, the formal piece of it for our senior level commands for group and wing commanders is literally, it's a 2-week course. That's it. And a lot of that is focused on administrative procedures, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, those kind of things. But the leadership aspect is expected to be something you've picked up and developed along the way. And so really it's experiential, if you would. But certainly those mentors, you know, I think the big 3 things that was put to me as I was approaching that was, you know, one, you have to, the minute you step in to the job, you need to think that you're training your replacement. So your subordinate commanders, you need to be training them to be you. And that's sometimes hard, but you have to think of it that way, because if you find yourself being irreplaceable, you're failing. You should be able to walk out of the organization for 2 weeks at a time with no email, no phone, and come back and everything's running smoothly. That tells you that you've delegated authority, you've trained your subordinate commanders well, and they are prepared to step. The other thing I was told early on was that, you know, the mission, taking care of the mission and taking care of your people will always be intention, and you have to manage it. And that was good to always have that in front of me, to remember that I had to strike a balance with how I demanded, what I demanded of my airmen, and remembering that they, you know, if we weren't in combat and we weren't downrange, that they had a life, they had a family, just like I did. And so, and then building your team around you to find people that don't think like you, because otherwise you're not going to get any creative ideas. There's going to be no innovation. So my vice wing commander, who is my deputy, I always picked somebody who was completely polar opposite, because that would allow me to always get a very different view on a problem. And it also helped, you know, some of my blinders. It helped remove some of those unconscious biases we might have on how we approach problem sets. Another thing I'll say is that my group command was something that I didn't know at the time. I wanted to go fly A-10s in Afghanistan, and instead I got put in the MQ-9 Reaper. I got put in charge of all of these assets that I had no experience in, intelligence assets and helicopters and C-130s and a radar station. And I really, frankly, wasn't exceptionally happy. I wanted to be an A-10 group commander so I could go fly A-10s in combat again, which was pretty selfish of me. But what I didn't understand was my senior leadership was grooming me and preparing me for that next level of command, because they knew how much complexity there was, and it wasn't about just flying airplanes. And this command in Afghanistan really gave me the experience with a communication squadron and maintenance squadron, a logistics squadron. It frankly gave me a practice to be a wing commander. So I was very thankful after the fact, because I had realized what an opportunity it was, and they were preparing me. It's that moment that, you know, we've either heard our parents say it, or you have a mentor or a leader say it, trust me, this will be good for you. And sometimes it doesn't feel like it, and we may not like it, but knowing that they do have your best interest in mind, trust is key.
Thanks for the overview. Sounds like you're always learning and covering your blind spots where you can, and learning in uncomfortable situations, and trusting your leadership. That's a really good one. Actually, I've got a question here from a member in the audience, Carl. He was wondering if there was any peer-on-peer assessment as pilots, or even as ground personnel, to assist you with your progress in your career, and how does that
Absolutely.
How does that occur? Yeah.
So there's both, I would say, formal and informal. The formal side of it is we take a check ride, which is an evaluation on an annual basis, both in 2 aspects. One is your instrument qualification, which is the ability to fly the aircraft precisely through maneuvers and fly instrument approaches. And then there's a mission check, which is your capability to do the mission at the assigned level. So if you're an instructor pilot, you have to go out and instruct a sortie, and you're observed by another pilot in the formation, or that evaluator may be simulating a student. So And so even as a wing commander, so as the highest ranking pilot on the base, I have a young captain whose job is to go out and give me an evaluation, which is a little bit of pressure on them, but it's also pressure on me because, I'm expected to be able to perform, and they have expectations of me because of the number of hours I have in the aircraft, and I'm a fighter weapons school instructor, or was. But I think more importantly is the informal culture in the fighter pilot community, which is the debrief. And I alluded to earlier, when you complete a mission. So when we step out the door, we typically will have objectives for that sortie. And they can be very precise. They typically in our world are kill and survive. So protect the friendlies and kill targets, in a precise manner. But we scope that with measurements, measures of performance, measures of effectiveness. And when we come back to the debrief, it can be pretty brutal. First rule is you check your rank at the door. So whoever the flight lead is, the number one in the formation, they're in charge. And it doesn't matter what your rank is. So if I'm flying as number 3, it doesn't matter that I'm a colonel, it doesn't matter that I have more experience and I have higher qualifications than anybody. My position that day was number 3. And so number 1 holds me accountable. And so if I screwed up an attack, it won't be sir, it won't be colonel, it'll be 3. What was the problem there? Why were you late? And I'm expected to answer to that. And so we don't spend a lot of time high-fiving. We'll identify what worked, but we don't spend a lot of time, celebrating what worked. We really spend a lot of time focusing on what didn't go right, because it's never 100%. And so I think that's unique about our community. It's been adopted in a lot of different areas. It's very structured. We go through and we identify what we call debrief focus points. So what are the things we really want to drill down on and figure out what went wrong or didn't go as right as we wanted. And we identify contributing factors. We figure out which one we would say is the root cause. We come up with an instructional fix, and we wrap it up into a lesson learned. And I'll tell you, folks who are outside our community can find it very intimidating and in some cases off-putting, because it gets pretty brutal. We roll up our sleeves and there's no ego. You leave it all behind. And then when we walk out of the room, then it's back to, there's no hard feelings. And so I think that's key when you start talking about continuous improvement. And so that's why it's very much peer-to-peer. And I think what really makes it unique in some cases, it's subordinate to superior, not only in rank, but also in your position in the flight. In that formation, number 4 of that 4-ship may be the youngest wingman, but he's expected to provide some input and value to the conversation. He's allowed to ask questions and say, why did this not happen? He's allowed to call people out and say, well, my flight lead turned the wrong way. Well, and number 3 shouldn't, shoot him a look. He should own that. And so I think it's important. It's a huge aspect, I think, that really is what makes that high level of performance that we're known for in a fighter squadron, is that accountability that is peer-to-peer more than anything.
Well, thank you. We have a couple of other questions. What I might do is move on and then jump to those questions a little
Sure.
after this next session. I was actually wondering, in previous conversations, I think I heard that 2002 was a pivotal moment in your career, and I guess it helped you to take your career to the next level. Can you tell us more about that and share your experience?
Sure. The 2002, we weren't even in Afghanistan. Our fighter squadron, in fact, we had no aircraft in Afghanistan because there were no usable airstrips out there for fighters. So we were actually in Kuwait, and in the A-10, we weren't even supporting this mission. We were actually there to provide Southern Watch, which was an operation to patrol the no-fly zone in Iraq. This was obviously prior to the Iraq War in 2003. So the Army went in to an area, and the intelligence was there was a small number of Al-Qaeda remnants there, and they were going to go in and capture the remnants of this group. And the intelligence, like all things, no good plan survives first contact with the enemy, because the enemy gets a vote. And in this case, there weren't 100 fighters, there were 1,000 fighters, and they weren't where we expected them. And so when the United States Army we also had some coalitions and joint special operations. In fact, we had Australian SAS participated in this mission as well. In fact, I got to support them, but the operation went badly from the start, and our guys and gals were in contact immediately, heavy contact. We lost a helicopter with a special operations unit on board at the top of a mountain, and the Army was in a very bad situation. And so they hadn't anticipated the need for a lot of close air support. So we got the 911 call, if you would, as in it was an emergency. And so we had no preparation for this mission. I was pulled out of the gym the night prior, told I was launching in 12 hours to go get some sleep, which was tough. But my wingman and I launched with limited intelligence and just showed up to chaos on the battlefield. But that's what we're trained to do. And luckily, I'd already graduated from the fighter weapons school. My wingman was a fighter weapons school graduate as well. So we were both highly experienced instructor pilots and both forward air controllers. And we were thrust into the situation to pretty much deconflict the airspace. And so we functioned as forward air controllers on our first sortie, which was almost 12 hours long, trying to sort out all of these aircraft. So we were operating in a piece of space that was, when you're moving around at 300 to 500 knots, is not very big when it's 9 kilometers by 5 kilometers. And there were 37 different ground controllers down in that airspace. So we were trying to protect them from fratricide, from the good guys dropping bombs on them because they didn't know where they were, or us running into each other or dropping bombs on each other. It was frankly chaos because we hadn't had an opportunity to plan for this. And so we had to pick it up on the fly, if you would. And so my wingman and I were put in charge of the battle space to try to sort it out, deconflict, and bring order back so we could prioritize requests for fire and close air support and keep both the friendlies on the ground and the aircraft in the air safe from each other, frankly, because it was more of a threat than the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda fighters on the ground, because the weapons they had weren't nearly as, they were effective, but we could counter most of them. So, but I spent a couple of days in that role because once we got there, they weren't going to let us leave. And so, as I like to say, I used the quote from Seneca, who said, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, right? And so it really did, was those 4 days launched my career because of the things I was able to do. But it was because I was prepared, because I had the experience of going through the fighter weapons school, and what that had prepared me to do was to step into this situation of chaos and execute. So, but it was exceptionally rewarding though too, because, and that's what I do love about the mission, is to be able to protect our folks on the ground. And as I said, it's not just Americans, it's our coalition teammates, to be able to come in and remove a threat and allow them and know them telling you on the radio that they're sleeping well that night because you're overhead is absolutely rewarding and something that, I'll keep with me forever.
Thanks for sharing. Actually, that's sounds like that sounds intense, but it sounds like the culmination of everything you've prepared for, and the expectation that that you're going to do what you do, and it all turned out accordingly. Yeah. I've got a question here. Campbell Reed asks, while the military experience tends to be procedure driven, did you feel you could innovate, and if so, how did you go about innovation and thought leadership? So a little off topic.
I think it's right there, because I think we do, I think that maybe sometimes we overstate the rigidity and the procedural aspect of the military. Absolutely. Is it there? Yes, it has to be, because of the discipline that's required in a lot of what we do, and the risk. Right. We even in training, it is mistakes cost lives in training, and they certainly do in combat. But I think on the innovation front is a lot of times we give our airmen a basic skill set, and then we throw them a very non-standard scenario or problem. And I think, though, to the wider point of how is it applicable outside the military, is I think when I was a commander, you have to set, as an organizational leader, you have to set the climate, right? You have to, and so what I used to tell my folks is, one of my number one rules was that I used to tell our youngest members of the organization, so our brand new airmen who had just come out of basic training, and I would get to talk to them as their wing commander in the first 2 weeks that they set foot on the base. And one of the things I told them was, I want you to ask why about everything. And it can get a little annoying, right? But it was more of a mindset. I said, if you walk past something and you think to yourself, why do we do it that way? I said, don't stop there. Finish one, use your outside voice, and finish the thought of, well, if I was in charge, we would do this. And so I used to say that if you ask your supervisor, why do we do this? And either you get the answer, one, that's the way we've always done it, or two, I don't know, then that supervisor owes you an answer. And what I've said is it's also a form of feedback to the supervisor, because if the supervisor doesn't know why, the supervisor needs to do some self-reflection and go, that's a good question. Why do we do that? And then typically when you start asking those questions, you find out you have inefficiencies or there's better ways of doing things. The other reason I always ask our youngest members is they don't have those biases. They haven't done it that way. And a lot of times they don't all come in just from high school. Some of them have been out in, like we say, the real world, doing other jobs, or maybe they've been in college or had other experiences, and they're bringing that in. And so I think that's, for me, it's a climate and a culture of allowing, and because my non-commissioned officers and my subordinate commanders knew that was my rule, then they knew that they had to answer the mail, that the airman had probably a way to get to me and say that he did what I told him, and he asked why, and he was told to shut up and color, and that's not an acceptable answer. So I think that we do have methods to do that, but it definitely requires leadership. It requires setting the tone in the environment and providing those opportunities for your young folks to come forward with ideas.
No, thank you. I like the takeaway. Use the outside voice. If I was in charge, why do I do this? That's awesome. Another question that we have. This is a lot of people on this forum are safety professionals and safety leaders in their field, and I think one of the questions came back asking if you have a specific framework in managing safety in daily operations. I think there's recognition here that the US Air Force Fighter Unit is a highly reliable organization, a high reliability organization, and guided by principles of collective mindfulness. So I guess the question is, what sort of specific frameworks help you to manage the safety of your crew, of your everyone under your command?
We definitely use operational risk management models. Clearly, when you look at safety, really jumped into the forefront in fighter aviation in the late 1970s. Our accident rates were off the charts, and so the Air Force really dove deep into safety as a culture. And so we have squadron safety officers and group safety officers and wing safety officers. And so on a day-to-day basis, we do operational risk management where we have a supervisor in the squadron, and every sortie that steps has to list out what are those risk factors for today's sortie. And obviously it's inherently risky, but there are things that we can mitigate and some things that we can't, right? What does the weather look like? I can't control that, but is there a way to maybe avoid it? What is the currency level, the members of my flight? If one of our members of the flight hasn't flown for a while, we shouldn't be doing a really complex sortie. We should go back to those building block approach. And so we look at that every day, and we force the flight lead to look at every member of his flight, look at all those risks, fatigue, sleep. We have requirements. We have to have 12 hours of uninterrupted rest, meaning I cannot be in my squadron, even if I'm surfing the internet, I can't be in my squadron 12 hours before I show up the next day. And of those 12 hours, I have to have an opportunity for 8 hours uninterrupted rest, meaning sleep, ideally. So I can't be at home doing email or work. So we try to really put the focus on thinking through up front, and we do this before we even step into the brief. So during the briefing, one of the key things we look at are, what are those high risk items within today's sortie? Let's identify them, let's talk about them, and let's figure out what we can do right now to mitigate or minimize to the best of our ability those factors. And then I think on a more macro level is, and I think that it's nothing, I'm not going to say anything that's unfamiliar to you all. I know you have similar methodologies and structures, but our safety folks, anytime we have a mishap, and that doesn't mean crashing an airplane, that's the worst, the class A. But even if we so much as scrape paint or maybe do damage to an airplane during an air refueling, just something that can happen, and it's very minor, we go back and we look at all those factors and we determine the same things, like what was causal, what was non-causal but worth discussing. And then we put it out in a report to the squadron, and all the pilots have to read that file. And then usually in our quarterly meetings, we bring up the bigger ones. And if there's something, and we share it across platforms. So there may be an accident in training command that has some lessons and applicability to things we do. And so we have access to those things. And all of that information, though, is privileged. So we have what we use is called safety privilege. So we give the details, not the names. We always redact the names. So it'll be Mission Pilot 1 and Mission Pilot 2. But the details of exactly what happened in the mishap are shared, because it's a need to know under that privilege with other pilots and across commands and weapon systems, so that everybody can learn from those mistakes, and ideally they're not repeated.
Thank you for that. That was actually another question about what sort of investigation and what does it look like? And I think just from understanding from what you said, it seems quite similar to how we would conduct a 5-wire or not, even further an ICAM investigation, and just share the learnings across everybody, across the group. Is there a specific phrase that you coined it under, or?
Not necessarily. I mean, our safety, we have a safety investigation board, and then we have a separate process called an accident investigation board. The safety board that's the privileged stuff to find out the why, so we don't have it happen again, especially if we've bent metal or hurt people. But the accident investigation board is the more serious one, which is going to find, in the case that maybe there's negligence, there may be ramifications or punishment involved. As a pilot, you may be grounded, or you could lose your wings if it's really severe in nature. If it's a maintenance professional who didn't follow procedures, and that's why an aircraft crashed, they're held accountable. So our boards are made up, and they have a standard structure when we do an aircraft investigation, where you have a pilot member, you have a maintenance member, you have a medical member, you have an aircraft flight equipment member, which is our life support equipment, which did my ejection seat function properly? Did I have the right gear? And then you have a board president, who is typically a senior officer. It's a colonel, typically for any kind of high-end investigation. If there's loss of life for an aircraft, it's actually a 1-star general. So we take them pretty seriously, and there's extensive training you have to go through training to be those members. And then we rely on your expertise and your background, and that's why you fill that membership of the board.
Fantastic. Thank you, Colonel. So then, moving from leadership in a framework sense and being innovative as a leader, can you talk to us about your experience as a cadet to the one where you were the former commandant of the U.S. Air Force Academy? Yeah, so I guess the question is, what does the academy do well to produce its next cohort of leaders?
What I tell our cadets when I talk to them, and they raise the same question is like, what is it that was most formative, or what do you believe that the academy did for you that, we have 3 accession sources. We have the Air Force Academy, we have Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC, which is going to a normal college and then you do ROTC program almost as an elective, like part-time. And then we have the Officer Training School, OTS, which is a 6-week course where if you already have your bachelor's degree, you can go through that course and then you're graduated from that after 6 weeks as a lieutenant. And so the Air Force Academy is 4 years of you're immersed in the military, in the Air Force for 4 years. And what I tell our cadets, and our chairman, our Joint Chiefs, says that's what all of our military academies makes them special and unique, is the immersive nature of them. But what I share with our cadets is it was 4 years of adversity in some way, shape, or form. And that's part of what this slide I put up for, is to say, if you've got some fears, we're gonna put you there. We're gonna make you jump out of airplanes. You can see there, it's not males only. That's our women boxing, by the way. All our cadets, regardless of gender. Now, just to put the question aside, women box women and men box men. But, one of the things we say is, one of our senior leaders once said, there's value in getting punched in the face. And a lot of people have never had that happen to them, right? It's an adversity. Flying, for some, believe it or not all our cadets want to be pilots, but, I'm not just going to put you in an airplane. I'll put you in an airplane without a motor, like one of our gliders, and take you up and far away and make sure that you can figure out how to get that thing back on the ground. And then I'm going to put you in a tear gas container and let you learn how to trust your gear and understand what that feels like. But obviously it's also 4 years of university, right? And what we really do is, because unlike a normal university, that's not all you're doing. Yes, you're going to class from 7:30 in the morning till 3:30 in the afternoon, but you're waking up way earlier because you have military duties in the morning. You're going to march to lunch, all 4,000 of you. And then at the end of the day, you're playing sports whether you want to or not. So if you're not an intercollegiate athlete, you have to do intramural athletics. And then you're having more military training at night. Sometime you're going to be flying, you're going to be jumping out of airplanes, and then you got to get your homework done. And so what it is it teaches you time management and prioritization. You've got to make trade-offs. You've got to make decisions. Because that's going to be your life, right? That's not unique to the Air Force. But I think that how we go about it really trains our cadets to step into a dynamic environment and be able to do those things. I think the other thing, was one of those questions earlier. I think it leads itself into this as well, is peer leadership. The cadet wing has a leadership structure. So every cadet is in a squadron. We have 40 squadrons of 100 cadets. And each of those squadrons have a leadership hierarchy. And the seniors are in charge. And they are the commanders of those squadrons, the cadet squadron commander. And then just like the Air Force, we have a group. So 10 squadrons in a group. And then in our, we have 4 groups in our wing. And we have 4 cadet group commanders, and we have a cadet wing commander. So we take a cadet and put them in charge of all 4,000 of their peers, which is not fun. And if you think back to your college days, it's not the same as being the class president. You get to make some unpopular decisions, like the entire cadet wing is restricted to base this weekend because we were goofing off in formation today. That doesn't make you very popular with your peers. And so we put them in those positions and they rotate through, so they all get opportunities in different times and places to understand it, because we tell them, look, this isn't going away. As a young lieutenant, you're going to be in charge of that enlisted chief master sergeant who has 26 years in the Air Force. You're 21 years old, just got out of college, but you have those lieutenant bars on. You're in charge. You're leading that person. So you're not just going to lead your peers who are also 18 to 26 years old, but you're going to lead that crusty old 48-year-old guy who's been around and could be your dad. And so I think that that's a unique experience that we provide, in and amongst all the obvious capabilities that we have, with flying and the training and the marching and all those things that, not many colleges can say that the whole university marches to lunch, sits down together, family style, for 25 minutes and has lunch together. We do it. And so a lot of unique things that I think we do a good job of preparing our young leaders.
Colonel, has the program in the academy changed over the years? Have you seen it evolve in any way?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I've seen, our superintendent, who's in charge, he's our 3-star general. So he's both a commander of the Air Force Academy and he's also the university president. He kind of does both things because of the unique aspects of a military academy. But what General Silveria likes to say is, and I steal his quote because I think it's a very effective way of describing it, is our program now is more deliberate and less demeaning. And so I think that I can look back, and I've shared with a lot of our cadets who will start talking about how, everybody had, I always tell them that your freshman year was the hardest year. That'll always be that way, right? Mine was the hardest year. No, mine was okay. And so what I say is, when I went through basic cadet training, which is the first summer you come in before you start school, and it's 6 weeks, I came in pretty lightweight and I lost 35 pounds. And I didn't have 35 pounds to lose. I might add 5. I won't say that I was I wasn't built, for speed necessarily, but I didn't have 35 pounds to lose. But we didn't ever eat, and it was part of the hazing, and there was a lot of it that went on back when I was a cadet. And I think we've gotten away from it, and we figured out. And when I speak, we bring our graduating classes back for reunions. The tough guys are the classes that graduated in the 60s and went to Vietnam, and they will typically challenge us on, it's not hard enough. And I said, yeah, and I usually try to disarm them and said, listen, I know it was harder when you were here, but I said, let's not have a conversation of, was it as hard as when you went through? I said, it's hard, just as hard, but in a different way. I said, we're making them do things now that I couldn't imagine doing as a cadet. We're teaching them how to fly remotely piloted aircraft. We're teaching them to use sophisticated systems. We're teaching them how to operate in a cyber environment. We have more satellites. The Air Force Academy has more satellites in orbit around the Earth than most countries do, okay? The Air Force Academy. And our cadets fly them. They build and fly satellites. So I tell our older classes that it's not about whether it's harder, it's different. And it's hard in a different way. And so I think that that's probably the biggest change I see, is that we're more deliberate. We can answer that why question. Why do we do that? Now, some things will never go away. Why do I have to march to lunch? Because it's a discipline thing and you're going to do it. I am not going to tell you that you will ever march again when you're an officer, or that it has any connection to what you do in the Air Force necessarily, but you're going to do it. But generally speaking, I think we're much more deliberate about how we conduct training.
Thank you for breaking that down. I guess we're moving on now towards the end of our webinar. And at the start, we alluded to the fact that you are a retiring colonel and you'll be leaving military life. And I guess the question I have here is, what sort of transition do you see? And how do you believe that the leadership skills that you have learned can be applied in a civilian environment?
I think, my choice, as a career pilot, there's the easy button, which frankly right now isn't so easy based on COVID-19. But, the easy button is to go fly for the airlines, which, that's a tough transition, because if you've driven a sports car your whole life, and then somebody hands you the keys to a school bus, it's not very exciting. That's just my take on it. No offense to my buddies who are airline pilots, but they're the ones who liken that job to driving a bus. And as they've told me, it's not very challenging. So really what I wanted to do was step into something that would where I could bring my experience and skill set into into an environment that would be challenging and enjoyable for me, because I love talking about leadership. I love practicing leadership. I love teaching leadership. And I think what I think is applicable about it is, is developing leaders. It crosses all boundaries, right? It doesn't matter whether you're a fighter pilot, a military officer, or you're running an organization. And as I alluded to, you have a small business of 10 people. I understand that was a flight commander at one time. I understand the ins and outs of small unit dynamics, but I also understand leading 11,000 people who aren't going to be very happy with you all the time. And also, as I alluded to earlier, what does it take to develop the next you? How do you find a way to not be the indispensable member of the organization or leader? How do you identify the members of the organization who are frankly have topped out, right? You put them one step, I think most folks are familiar with the Peter principle in business, where you promote to failure. How do you avoid that, right? And I think there is a method by which you do. I'm not saying that everybody can be the CEO of a company, but there are methods by which you can allow people to fail forward in a safe environment in practice, which is one of the things we do at the Air Force Academy is I like to say is put somebody in an environment where their decisions aren't going to hurt people or bend metal. So it's okay to fail. Let's let them fail, because we all learn more from that than succeeding. Back to my comment about why in the debrief as fighter pilots, we focused on what went wrong, because there's more value in that than just focusing on what went right all the time. So I've definitely, I think I've thought long and hard about it, which is why I've selected the area of leadership development and executive coaching as kind of a natural transition for me, so that I can keep doing what I really enjoy, because there's really no civilian equivalent of flying fighter jets out there. So I had to fall into what's the other thing that I've really enjoyed in 25 years. And I really do think it's leading people, but more so than leading them is brought me great enjoyment over the last few years is to see some of my young lieutenants when I was a young leader now as wing commanders who have gone and excelled and are now leading those large organizations. It's that proud parent moment to see your subordinate commanders pass you. I mean, that's the greatest thing in the world, right? Is to have them do greater things than you did. And, to see, the fighter wing that I gave up to my good friend, Johnny Bravo, that's his call sign. To see him come out on the 1-star general list was awesome. To see, to have him come back to me and say I had a hand in getting him there was awesome. So I think that's really what drove me to kind of choose that as what's next, or as I like to say to my wife, deciding what I want to be when I grow up. Now that I have to grow up and can't be a fighter pilot anymore.
That's awesome. Colonel, so you are transitioning out of military life right now, and I think you mentioned that you are going to do a coaching or leadership / mentoring a role. So for members of the audience, if they wanted to hear more from you or wanted to get in touch with you, how do they contact you or find out a bit more about what you're going to do next?
It's two ways. So me personally, and I'm perfectly fine with you sharing my email, Ronaldo, but is really just to reach. I'm not at the stage where I've got a website or anything like that personally built out. So my email of scott.c.campbell95@gmail.com is the easiest way to get me personally. And then the group that I'm jumping on with is actually an interesting crew of ex-Navy SEALs, a number of special operations folks, and a number of Fortune 50 executives, group called uh, uh, I just drew a blank. It'll come back to me in a second, just because I was thinking about something else. But I would say that that's another method I'll get you that contact information going forward. But I've just decided to jump on with these guys as a good method for me to kind of get my feet wet going forward with some professionals. Sorry, the name of the group is Victory Strategies, and you can find them online. Mainly because I wanted to get with a team that had the experience outside of the military. So what attracted me to them was just a unique pairing of, in fact, one of our teammates was a vice president for global safety at General Motors, and he retired after 40 years with General Motors. So we have pretty unique personalities that way they pair us up, so that I've got a guy who's really familiar with the corporate world, and they leverage our military leadership opportunities. So, but yeah, that's kind of my going forward method to get my feet right into the game as quick as I can and continue to do what I really love.
No, cheers for that. Victory Tactics.
Victory Strategies.
Strategies, yeah. And mind you, just for anyone who's listening, when you mention weapons training school, that means Top Gun Academy, or how most people would recognize it. So you're at the highest level of the Air Force anyway. Yeah,
I'd like to. My wife tries to tell me I'm not when we get into the conversation who's the better fighter pilot. But yeah, we like to joke. I have a lot of good friends who are Navy fighter pilots that ours is the tougher program. The Navy, because the Navy movie was much more popular, and as everyone is probably aware, they're coming out with a new Top Gun movie this summer. So it gets them all the notoriety. We joke that we're busy getting the job done while they make movies. But yeah, the U.S. Air Force weapons school is our Top Gun. So the Navy's is about 2 months long. Ours is 6 months long. So ours is a little bit more challenging. Maybe I'm a little biased, but that's just my opinion.
Okay, so there's weapons school, and then there's the Navy side of the business as well.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, and just one more question before wrapping up.
Yeah.
We have a question about helping veterans transition to life outside of the military and how they also help families to cope. What's your experience been like?
We have a very robust program, both formal and informal. And what they call it is we have an acronym for it called TAP, which is Transition Assistance Program. And for every one of our members, and it could be a young enlisted airman who just does one enlistment, right? He signs up for 4 years just to get some experience, get his GI Bill, which is his college paid for by the government by serving. But whether it's him or it's somebody like me or even our 4-star generals who don't exactly have a lot of problems transitioning or finding work, the more senior you are, the more, obviously more opportunities there are. But we're mandated actually by the Congress. We have to go through a 1-week program that tells us we learn about all of the veterans assistance, labor programs. So there's a lot of programs out there. They have all kinds of organizations that are separate. They're not just the government, the Veterans Affairs, the VA, which is our government organization, but they connect us with all these other agencies that are either nonprofits or they specialize in it, or a lot of our companies here in the US now have very specialized veteran onboarding programs. And in fact, this group that I'm with, Victory Strategies, it's really how they got started. Was a number of these Navy SEALs had gotten help from these larger corporations to transition into the business world. And then when they decided that they wanted to get into this leadership development and coaching, they turned around and actually brought some of these corporate folks who helped them transition and onboarded them. And so we have a pretty robust capability these days. And there's a lot of preferential hiring programs. So I would say that we do a really good job. And for our younger airmen, we actually now have created these skills programs that are almost like internships. And we allow a transitioning member in their last 6 months, when they're still being paid by the Air Force, to actually go to a company to get a civilian job skill set. And ideally that company will onboard them after those 6 months. So for 6 months, the Air Force is paying them to be at that company learning a skill or a trade. And then at the end, as they transition out of the military, ideally they're in position to really jump on board with a company. So I think over the last, in particular, the last decade, there's been a lot of focus on it. I think we've got a lot of really solid programs where companies are reaching out. And so veterans aren't doing much to find work. Companies are finding them.
That's fantastic. Thank you for your time, Colonel. And just to wrap up everything you have mentioned today, in a couple of key words, what I've got was immersion, adversity, and university. So I could always learning, getting involved, getting hands like knee deep into whatever you're doing, and always being challenged. And when you combine all of that preparation and meets opportunity, I think people are just generally equipped to succeed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Colonel Campbell, thank you for your time, actually. I'm sure members in our webinar appreciate everything you've said today. And I think we have an opportunity to forward your email address, and also they can look you up if they need your help a bit later on or want to hear more from you.
You bet. Yep. Please share it. And it's been my pleasure. Like I said, I wish I could be there in person and spend more time afterwards answering questions and chatting with folks. But plenty of challenges these days. But again, thanks to Sarah for getting the technology set up so that we could do this. And it's I really appreciate the offer to come share some thoughts with everybody today. And I've really enjoyed spending the time. And thanks for some great questions as well.
All right. Thank you, Colonel.
You bet. Thanks, and have a great rest of your day. Mine's over.
See you later.
Take care.